Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about peer social genetic effects. What the heck are those, and what does it mean for mental health? So as usual, I'll start with a take-home message. After a minute or two, I'll jump into the body of the talk. Take-home message is that peer social genetic effects mean that who you hang out with shapes who you become, and we've known for a long time that it's not just your own genetics that contribute to mental health. We know that your own genetics do. We know environmental factors have a role too. But one of the environmental factors is who you hang out with, but not just the behavior of who you hang out with, but actually the genetics of the people you are hanging out with. So that's what peer social genetic effects are. So this study, and I'm focusing on a single study, which I think should have gotten much more recognition and talk than it's gotten so far. That's why I'm choosing to talk about it. Again, their findings were it was the genetics of the people you are hanging out with in high school years that influence or increase your risk for future pathological behavior. So it wasn't just these people or peers, peer pressure, were behaving in ways that were depressed, anxious, or drug using themselves, but something in their genetics was creating something in the environment that at a later point puts you at risk. So this was done in a Swedish population. Simple findings were that schoolmates had a bigger impact than who your neighbors or where you lived, so it's who you were hanging out with. Drug and alcohol abuse behaviors were more strongly influenced than depression or anxiety. And that is the take-home message, and I'll jump into the talk itself. So this was a study conducted by several researchers. Kenneth Kendler was one of them. He's at Virginia Commonwealth University, and for decades he has been leading studies on genetic influences over mental health problems and is probably the leading figure in that area. The lead author was Jessica Salvatore at Rutgers University, and there were three Swedish collaborators at Lund University in Malmö, Henrik Olsen and Jan and Kristina Sundqvist. So the study looked at the entire Swedish population, everyone born between 1980 and 1998. They are an organized Scandinavian country. They have these records. So actually, not everyone was included. So you had to be Swedish born, and your parents had to be Swedish born. So that's trying to eliminate the effect of immigrant communities and others, a lot of both genetic and socioeconomic and other factors that might have confounded it. Second, they excluded about 15% of the population that didn't go on to what's called secondary higher education, high school equivalent, a little beyond high school for the US. So, and we know that 15% who doesn't go on to high school are actually at higher risk. So this is a fairly moderate, this is the whole population of Sweden, but it's not many studies focus on higher risk groups. Populations just took them out of the equation. It also excluded if you were the second twin in a family. That would confound some of the genetic influences in the study. So they wound up with about 655,000 individuals, 2/3 of a million. And they divided each person based on where at age 15 they lived, and they looked at three different sizes: 1,000-meter square area, a slightly larger area of a few blocks, and then it also looked at the level of the municipality or city or town that someone lived in, so three different geographical hierarchies. And then they also looked at three different school measures. So one is what school you were at age 16. The second one was what school you were at for between ages of 18 and 19 for your upper secondary school. And then secondary to not just which school physically you were at or a education level, but also whether you were on a track for vocational education or whether you're on a pre-college track. And what they used as measurements was registration in any. So they were measuring 4 different mental health conditions. They were looking at drug abuse, alcohol use, depression, and anxiety between the ages of 17 and 30. And for that, they looked at all medical records. So if your doctor ever indicated that you had one of these diagnoses, they looked at pharmacy records, see if that indicated taking methadone or something like that would indicate a substance use disorder, even if you hadn't appeared in the medical records that way. And they also looked at legal registries. Were you arrested for drug abuse or alcohol use, misuse? So they combined all of that. They were done with anonymous identifiers, so no individuals were pulled out or examined or scrutinized that way. And then they developed what they called family genetic risk scores, FGRSs, by looking at everyone from your first degree relatives through the 5 degrees, 5th degree relatives. They looked at who in that extended family had a drug abuse problem, who had an alcohol use problem, who had a depression problem, who had an anxiety problem, each of those separately. They did this in half the population, and they did it for each of the 6 levels of the geography and education. So for your 100-meter area around you, what is the genetic FGRS risk score for the population in that area? And then they used those numbers for each individual. They found a deviation score or a residual score, how different an individual is from that community level. And they looked at so they did this in half the population and then looked at the second half of the population. So each individual's own genetics didn't contribute to the family genetic risk score of the school or geographic area that they were looking at. So they weren't contaminating it. So this kind of splitting the population and making a measure in half of it and applying that measure to the second half is commonly done to avoid certain problems with individual contamination and random fluctuation and validation. So then for each of these entities, for each school, for each geographic location, for each condition, they broke the FGRS, the family genetic risk score, into quintiles, 5 groups from high family genetic risk, medium to lowest. And then they compared in this study, all the numbers somewhere you could look at, but in the study that was published, they looked at comparing the highest risk quintile to the lowest family genetic risk quintile. And they found, jump to those in a minute, strong associations between if you're exposed to a high FGRS, high family genetic risk score, if your peers had a high family genetic risk score, particularly in your secondary education, then you would have an increased risk for yourself developing alcohol abuse, drug abuse, depression or anxiety at a later age. And they also went back and corrected the data, corrected it for socio-demographic factors, so unemployment, income, education, welfare, immigration status of the parent. And again, they calculated for each individual records based on those different registration sources, whether they themselves ever ran into a substance use problem, an alcohol misuse problem, depression or anxiety. So what they found was based on your school, peers in your school, the genetic risk factor of the people you were exposed to, that had an impact on your future rate of either substance abuse problems or internalizing disorders, depression or anxiety. And the effect size based on your school ranged from 1.03 to 1.59. Those are hazard ratios. So that means there's a 3% to 59% increase. 59 is pretty big, depending on who you were exposed to in school. Higher numbers correlated with particularly which track in your upper secondary education, vocational track versus college track, people you were presumably spending the most time with at that time of life. The track had a bigger effect than just which secondary school you went into, which had a bigger effect than just which school you were in middle school years, 7 to 16. And the geography also had some impact. The hazard ratios from 1.01 to 1.09, so about a 1 to 9% increased risk with the people closer community in the smaller area near you having some increased risk, and a smaller impact than on school. And for all these, the effect on drug and alcohol substantially larger, 1.59 or 1.56, than the impact it had on the hazard ratio for developing depression or anxiety. Anxiety was 1.19, depression was 1.15. And that, again, is comparing the highest risk peer group. They also did control effects on looking at just height rather than drug abuse or other things. The magnitude of the effect there was tiny. Overall, their effects on depression and anxiety were pretty small, or very small. Their effects overall on alcohol and drug use, they considered were small effects, but measurably 5 times bigger than the effect of sort of that null hypothesis, the impact of your peers' genetics on your own height. So their conclusions from this were 4. There is a measurable peer social genetic effect, that your peers' genetic propensity to develop drug or alcohol problem, depression, or anxiety increased your own future risk for developing one of those conditions, specifically for each of those conditions. And again, the effect was stronger for drug use or alcohol use than for depression or anxiety, but measurable for all of those. And that risk, secondary school, late high school, just before going to college, was more impactful than earlier school peer group. School group was more important than your geography. Their conclusion was that they found no evidence that there were confounding variables that explained this connection. So it wasn't just that people in certain communities or certain cities or certain when they controlled for socioeconomics and education and other factors, some of these, the genetic makeup of your peers had a somewhat smaller effect, but still a robust effect. So it didn't change it much. So it did not appear that any of the obvious confounding factors or variables were what was explaining this connection. The third conclusion was that there was minimal evidence that peer pathology per se explains what was going on. So again, it was who you were hanging out with in late high school years, but it wasn't that these people in high school years were the ones who already had a substance use problem, who had depression, had anxiety. There were some who did have that, but that didn't seem to be the mediating factor. This was a very large study. The statistics are quite robust. So their conclusion, it wasn't overt expressions of pathology that were having an influence. The measures of pathology are fairly severe or extreme cases. So they're capturing people who are being treated in the medical system or being arrested for those conditions. If your peers' genetics are modifying your own later behavior in some way, there's some mechanism that's happening. And the most obvious one is that it's the behavior of those kids at that age that you're hanging out with. The point is that it's not overtly, they're not drunkards, they're not shooting up every day, they're not overtly depressed, suicidal to an obvious extent, but the presumption is the most parsimonious behavior is that it's lower level measures. So maybe they're normalizing, smoking substance X or taking pill Y a couple times a week, or maybe on weekends, or just greater exposure to behaviors that are not at the extreme end of pathology, but maybe predisposing it, are what the mechanism for how your peers' genetics influence your later susceptibility to these conditions. And the last point they make is that individuals who are most susceptible to their peers' genetics were individuals who themselves had higher genetic predispositions. So someone who had a higher genetic predisposition themselves to becoming an alcoholic, to have an alcohol abuse problem, were more susceptible to their peers' genetics than someone who wasn't at high risk. But it's clear, again, from their statistical analysis that your own genetics were not explaining this or your entire risk. There again is some interaction between your own genetics and your peers' genetics. So problems or objections to this study. One is this was done in a fairly homogeneous genetically and sociologically. There's much more equality in Sweden than in many other countries. So might this not apply elsewhere? It's conceivable. Actually, one would probably expect the opposite. In a more heterogeneous society, there's probably more likelihood that which peers you wind up hanging out with are going to be influencing you. Again, another criticism was that their measures of pathology are only capturing the most extreme cases, so it misses out on the ability to know how much or what aspects of peer behavior, not just their genetics, in high school may be influencing you at a later state in time. And there have been some objections methodologically in terms of, again, both making categorical statements rather than spectrum statements about these conditions. That takes away some of the power. Also, that we're making measurements at one point in time. What if people switch schools 6 times? There's just one measurement of where you were at 15, where you were at 18 or 19. So that could muddy or dilute some of the effects. Bottom line is your mama was right when she said, I don't want you hanging out with those kids at school. And you said, but Mom, they're not doing anything. They're not getting in trouble. They're not breaking the law. She was right that even if they weren't, maybe they were doing other behaviors that might lead you astray later in life. Again, these are not huge effects, but they are measurable effects, given that we would like to do everything we can to minimize depression, anxiety, substance abuse, alcohol abuse. This is important information. So stay healthy and watch who you hang out with or your kids hang out with in high school.